Hello, this is Eric Martin, Professor of History at Lewis Clark State College. You must be in History 102 if you're watching this. So, in today's video, what I want to do is spend a little bit of time setting up the video Unit 15 from Bridging World History, but mostly setting up the readings from Worlds of History, Chapter 15, in the idea that we'll be able to generate some more productive discussion on the discussion boards and, raise your grades in the process. So, now, one of the first things we have to talk about is historical skills. Each week, there is going to be a certain set of historical skills that y'all are going to be working on. These are the kinds of skills that historians use all the time, but they're also the kind of skills that are useful to you in terms of being a generally educated person to try to figure out how to accumulate data, assess data, interpret data, and then, figure out what to do with it. And in our particular case, right, it's historical data that we are working with. Now, the historical skills for our very this unit here on in chapter 15 really focuses on the issue of primary and secondary sources. Now, go back to the posting I put up about what is history. It specifically addresses primary and secondary sources. You need to know the difference between the two. All right, you need to know the difference between the two, and the very first thing you should be doing as you read the material in Worlds of History for each of those individual documents is decide, is this a primary source or is this a secondary source? Remember, primary sources were created at the time that we're studying, the 15th century in our case. Secondary sources are the stuff that people like me, historians, write about the 15th century using those sources. And we need to be able to use both. So the Worlds of History book is a combination, primary sources, secondary sources. Most chapters have a few of each. Some chapters just focus on one because that's the skill. All right. Now, the other thing you need to keep in mind before you just get into it is whenever you're reading a piece of historical evidence, whether it is a primary source or a secondary source, there's some real basic questions you have to ask yourself about that piece of evidence before you can start figuring out what it means. And it's all real simple stuff, but I think it's useful to be reminded of it. You need to ask yourself, who wrote the source? Who were they? Who are they? And history, I hope this bleeds over into your other courses and into other areas of your life. But one of the things that history has taught me is before you go off and read a book or before you go off and take someone's interpretation of things as anything other than entertainment, you need to find out who they are. And you need to find out the historical circumstances under which they lived. And you need to have some kind of a context of who the author is of this document. It can make all the difference in the world in terms of understanding why they wrote what they wrote, which is the next thing. When you're looking at these sources, you need to take a look at who created the source, but why was the source created? Very rarely are historical sources, produced by someone who says, I think I'll, write down something so that, students in the 21st century can know all about the 15th. That's not why they're written. So you need to get a sense to yourself about why these sources are written, because that's going to also help you to figure out what they mean. When were they written? You don't have to memorize dates in this course, but we have to use them. In the end, History is the study of change over time, and we have to be able to deal with dates. You need to ask yourself, where was the source written, and where was the source focused on? You need a sense of geography for each of these sources. And then the other thing you need to know is what kind of a source is it? What kind of information are you dealing with? That you ask yourself these questions about every single source you read in this class. And it'll make your life a lot easier. And generally it'll help you come up with stuff to talk about. Hey, I found this out about the author. And based on the fact that he said this other thing, this is what I think. All right. So there's that. If you need more information about that, read the introduction to Worlds of History. Kevin Riley goes into that a little bit. Now, in terms of the mission for this week, the mission is to have a discussion focused on the following question. What appears to be the major similarities and differences between Chinese and European expansion, that's mainly Spanish expansion, but also some Portuguese, in the 15th century? What do these similarities and differences tell us? So right off the bat, we're getting into comparative history. You're going to have to figure out something about Chinese expansion. What was it? What are some of the basic characteristics of it? How do we know about it? And you're going to have to figure out something about European expansion. What was it? What motivated it? What are some of the characteristics about it? The Bridging World History video series addresses this issue by specifically looking at the role of silver in the 15th century. So pay close attention to that. What is the role of silver in the 15th and the 16th centuries in particular? The other way that it is addressed is through our Bridging World History documents. And you need to pay careful attention to these. And I'm just kind of going to go through a couple of them to make sure that we're good to go. The first two documents, one of them is a secondary source, one of them is a primary source. You figure out which is which. Deal with Chinese expansion, and particularly the incredible voyages of Jing He. And if you have never heard of this Chinese admiral, then this is the first thing you should do with your Traditions and Encounters textbook. Look up the Chinese voyages of Chinese expansion in the early 1400s. Look up the Ming Dynasty. Look up Jing He. That book will help you put these two sources into a much greater context. So based on Traditions and Encounters, based on the Bridging World History video that talks about silver, and based on these two documents, what does Chinese expansion in the 15th century look like to you? What are the motivations? What are the techniques? What are the ideas and goals? What are the long-lasting effects? You get the idea. The next three documents in the Worlds of History textbook focus on European expansion. There's one secondary source and two primary sources. And again, you guys figure it out. One of the sources focuses on Vasco da Gama's voyage into the Indian Ocean and into India. So that's pretty interesting for really looking at Portuguese perceptions of what India was like, and then the Portuguese perceptions of what they thought the Indians thought about them, if that makes sense. Y'all read that document carefully. It's a pretty interesting one. It's not necessarily straightforward. It makes a really nice comparison with document number 2, because with document number 2, you have a sailor on Jing He's voyages describing some of the places he goes to in the Indian Ocean. And now you've got a sailor on Vasco da Gama's voyage describing some similar places. And then just based on their descriptions of the same places, maybe you can figure out some things about them. You guys get the idea? Okay. And then the final two documents deal with Christopher Columbus specifically, dealing with Christopher Columbus's first voyage. One of the documents is the letter that he sends to the King and Queen of Spain explaining what he has just done. Read it carefully. What's it sound like he has just done? And then the final document is written by Kirkpatrick Sale. He's a pretty interesting character. He definitely has an axe to grind about Columbus, but here's the deal. Is he wrong? Like, as you read the primary sources, compare what he says Columbus was up to the letter in which Columbus is telling the king and queen what he's up to. And then the mission is to decide, is Kirkpatrick Sale accurate about this kind of thing? So again, use the Traditions and Encounters book to frame the Portuguese expansion into the Indian Ocean, to frame the Spanish expansion into the Americas. And then once you do those things, you'll be able to compare them. So you can talk about them individually on the discussion boards if you want to, but then you can start moving in towards a comparison. Okay, that's all I have for you. I just wanted to give you some pointers in terms of some stuff to look for as you go along. It's fun stuff. I encourage you to get to the reading and enjoy it. If you got any questions about this stuff, feel free to drop by my office during my office hours. Feel free to call me on the phone during my office hours. Feel free to email me, and enjoy your historical studies.